All right. The truth can now be revealed. I'm just like a really long warm-up act for Rick Lee. And it's one of those things where, like a really sort of interesting musician wants a really not so talented musician to be the warm-up band. So that's my function this afternoon. Thanks to Dell for the invitation. Thanks to you all for coming out, though I suspect that the attraction has more to do with the topic than with me, which is exactly as it should be. The question is more interesting than I am. In fact, you may be wondering about now, why have they sent an old white man to talk to us about sex? And one answer to that question is, welcome to college. Historically, the American college has been one of the great scenes of sexual regulation. When men were the only ones allowed to attend colleges, they were herded together at regular intervals in the chapel or the gym for a stern lecture by the chaplain, the president, the dean of students, from coach, in which they would be threatened with dire consequences for yielding to lust. Consequences divine and medical, but also civil and academic. Anyone got the answers? Okay. Yeah. These are actually questions, fill-in-the-blank questions from a 1950s sex ed quiz. The translation of this, I think, is, if you do filthy things, God will punish you and you'll be riddled with disease, but we, the college authorities, will also punish you by public shaming and expulsion. When women were finally allowed to have colleges of their own or admitted to women's colleges, a similar scene was repeated after carefully segregating the sexes because, of course, people of the same sex couldn't possibly be sexually attracted to each other. Then the dean of women's students, or nurse or coach, would deliver the stern lecture, adding to the standard threats the strongest cautions about saving yourself for marriage and motherhood. The word wifehood is a discovery for me. I don't think I've ever heard that word before, but it goes well with motherhood. They're obviously very closely related. Now today, many universities count themselves beyond all of this. Indeed, it was the boast of undergraduates of my ancient generation that we pressed administrations to abolish college rules about sex. And yet, rules about sex have a way of creeping back in where you least expect them, often under the guise of sexual liberation or progressive politics. So let me say, I am not here to re-regulate your sex. If anything, I want to deregulate it. I will not give you an updated version of the Stern lecture. I want instead to think with you about some questions. It'll take a few minutes to set them up. Please bear with me. After a few decades of study and activism, I draw at least two lessons from the history of how human groups regulate sex. This is the first lesson. Sexual regulation differs dramatically from place to place and time to time. Different regulatory schemes pick out different aspects of sexual experience and then use them to compile lists of what is normal or pure or natural. Indeed, the way people talk about sex has varied more than the ways people have sex, since the repertoire of human genital acts appears more limited than human imaginings about what sex means. We tend, when we think of sexual diversity, the diversity of regulatory schemes, we tend to look mainly at the cultural diversity of systems as if the systems were static. But for living within a system, it can be more important to remember that every regulatory system changes with time. Sometimes the change is marked as a dramatic break. We speak about the sexual revolution in America of the 1960s. But important change can also be concealed underneath claims that nothing is changing, that the system is eternal. Consider the many varieties of sexual ethics taught by groups that claim to be Christian. We hear often about disagreements among Christian groups in the present, say between liberals and conservatives. It's actually more interesting to consider how the ethics of all Christian groups have shifted over the past 150 years. No Christian group today, no matter how conservative, teaches sexual ethics the way it was taught in this country 150 years ago. A second lesson follows. The most consequential changes in sexual regulation occur in the basic categories and characters that are used to sort acts and to personify desires. Rules about sex generally presuppose that specific acts should be regulated. I call those categories. And that certain kinds of people or agents do them. I call those characters. Any large-scale system for judging sex needs specific categories and characters before it can begin to pass judgments. No system proves its categories and characters. It assumes them. They have the authority of nature. They are supposed to represent the way things really are. In fact, a successful system of sexual ethics tries to make it impossible for anyone to talk or think outside of its categories and characters. So what if we apply these two lessons to our own situation, by which I mean widely shared speeches about sex in the United States? What are the categories and characters without which we find it almost impossible to talk about sex? I would say that one indispensable category for us is sexual identity. And one necessary character is the subject of identities, the identified person. I can illustrate the power of this pairing with two exchanges from my own classes. The first took place in a large core curriculum class I teach on sexual ethics. We were talking about the case of an infant we now know as David Peter Reimer, but who was originally described in reports as both John and Joan. Let me call this person by the letter J to avoid begging the question of gender. J was born male, as we say, but J's penis was badly damaged by medical malpractice at the age of 8 months. A year later, under medical pressure, the parents consented to further surgery that would enable them to raise J as a girl. After a few more years, J began to experience desires and to exhibit behaviors that were interpreted heterosexually as male. A battle of medical authorities ensued until at the age of 14, J chose to undergo more surgery and to begin hormone shots in order to transition to an adolescent male. Now, notice the compulsory categories applied to J. J was compelled not only to become either male or female, but to conform to heterosexual standards, since J's attraction to girls interpreted heterosexually was used to determine J's gender. Okay, that was the case before my class. In our discussion, one of the most thoughtful students said, "We need a sex-gender identity for all the people who don't fit into sex-gender identities." Here's the second story from a graduate seminar on queer Christian theology, that is, on efforts to understand the consequences for Christian thinking of undoing the old condemnations of same-sex love. We had before us a paper by a British theologian, Elizabeth Stewart, in which she argues that Christian baptism, the ritual of Christian initiation, strips away a person's social identities, including sexual identities, in order to remake them as a new creation. Stewart's argument is basically that after baptism, your only identity is your identity in Christ. You have no other identities. One of the students in the class objected very strongly to this argument. He said, "Saturday night, I sat beside the hospital bed of an undocumented gay sex worker who is dying of AIDS. You can't take away his gay identity. It's all he has left." My point in recounting these stories is not at all to criticize the students who made these remarks. Their remarks reflect quite accurately the way we talk now. The idea of sexual identity has such a grip on our speech that we cannot talk without it. Having a sexual identity has become a universal obligation, even for people who explicitly reject identity schemes. If you deny sexual identity, that is interpreted just as declaring another peculiar sort of sexual identity. What is more important, as the second story shows, your sexual identity now constitutes part of your ethical core as a human being. I don't believe either of those claims is true. I don't think we're obliged to have a sexual identity. I don't think sexual identity is part of our ethical core. Indeed, the more necessary the category sexual identity seems, the more I suspect that it is only the prized assumption of our prevailing scheme of sexual regulation. Its identity is an effect of its being required by the power under which we live. But these are the questions I hope to pursue with you. So, 3 questions. Does every person or every adult really have to have a sexual identity? What is having a sexual identity supposed to do for you? And what does it do in fact? Finally, if we suddenly decided to stop talking about sexual identities this afternoon, what other ways could we talk? What would it be to have unidentified sex, or to live as an unidentified person whose ways of having sex didn't automatically imply a sexual identity? In articulating these questions, as in my title, I focus on sexual identities. You might object that sex or sexuality can't be separated from other things like race or ethnicity, class, economic status, religious membership, and so on. I would agree with you, but in our short time together, I want to focus on sexual identity, partly because the concept has a distinct history. So, question 1, does every adult have to have a sexual identity? The question has a fairly easy answer, at least historically. Most human adults have lived without the concept of sexual identity. If they had one, they didn't know it. Sexual identity is a fairly new category, newer even than the categories homosexual and heterosexual, which aren't all that old. The term sexual identity begins to circulate widely in English only in the 1950s. In fact, you can still watch the term being constructed towards the end of that decade. In a revealing paper from 1959, a psychologist, Thomas Colley, sets out to define total sexual identity by drawing together earlier scientific authorities. He wants the term, so this is 1959, This is Colley defining what he regards as an emerging category. He wants a term to combine Freudian theories of internal causes of development with later social theories of external causes. He claims that sexual identity brings together biological, sociological, and psychological norms. Now, when someone offers you a tidy category that supposedly combines three separate sciences, the obvious question is whether it actually holds together. And I don't think that Colley's mixture of concepts does. In other words, at least on this definition, sexual identity is incoherent from the start. On the one hand, adult sexual identity is supposed to be the fulfillment of a biologically objective teleology, or sequence of development. A certain sexual identity, namely reproductive heterosexuality, is, according to Colley, a biological norm. But the term sexual identity also functions as a diagnostic category with implications for treatment. Sexual identity means a legal medical classification useful for containment of disease and so-called treatment. Here, the norm, in the second case, the norm is the medically normal, what a dominant regime enforces as healthy, which points to a third sociological meaning of sexual identity as a standardized sexual social construct. Here, the norm means the currently prevailing models of socially acceptable sexual selves. In short, sexual identity is supposed to bring together natural growth, legally enforceable health, and social acceptance. I conclude again that the category sexual identity is both recent and incoherent. I'm hardly the first person to draw this conclusion. The category has been subjected to a lot of critique, including by some of the best-known academic writers on sex and gender. Among writers of what's called queer theory, for example, you can find sharp critiques of identity language in Michel Foucault and Judith Butler. Feminist theory from way back, feminist theory knows sophisticated ways to separate identity claims from efforts to organize around strategic labels. In political theory, yet again, you can find academic critiques of particular identities or self-aware disputes about identity politics in American manifestos from the 1960s and 1970s. So even as people are writing manifestos using identity, they're saying, ugh, identity, not so sure. In short, a lot has been written against conceiving your true sex or gender through an identity, especially an identity countersigned by the state and its medical officers. And yet, as far as I can see, these critiques have had very little effect on our daily speech, even for speakers who have studied the critical works. I can sharpen this point. The category sexual identity spread rapidly through the underground gay press during the late 1960s and early 1970s. It was widely adopted by groups that were, at the same time, fighting against psychiatric definitions of homosexuality. So these groups adopted the category sexual identity despite their rejection of at least part of the category's official explanation. Though they rejected psychiatry, they took up a term with psychiatric origin and a lingering institutional odor. If that little bit of word history still doesn't convince you that there's a puzzle here, I would suggest that you perform an experiment. The next time you find yourself in a class discussing Foucault's History of Sexuality 1, or at a hipster cafe listening to the person at the next table showing off his knowledge of Foucault, and it is almost always a he. Listen for the word identity. Now, it is a textual fact that in History of Sexuality 1, Foucault only uses the word identity in the mathematical sense or else negatively, as an idea to be avoided. Indeed, History of Sexuality 1 begins and ends by mocking movements of sexual liberation that exalt identity. Once speaking to the oldest French gay organization, Foucault phrased his objection bluntly. I quote, pleasure is something that passes from one individual to another. It is not the secretion of an identity, because pleasure has no passport, no identity card. Pleasure has no passport, no identity card. That's Foucault. But if you listen in most classes or eavesdrop at the cafe, you'll discover that people almost invariably explain Foucault in terms of identity theory. Because we can't talk about sex these days without talking identity. Unfortunately, dear friends, sexual identity is a zombie category. You can't kill it by theoretical critique or historical investigation. It just gets up again. And it turns everything it bites into identity speech. So we have to find a different way to fight back. When a new category spreads this quickly and resists well-justified critique, the obvious question is, what need is it fulfilling? What are people using it for? Or more precisely, what is it advertised to do, and what is it actually doing? Let's put those questions to the category of sexual identity. What is sexual identity supposed to do for us? Colley's definition of sexual identity has already implied a general answer to this question. If Colley is right, becoming a well-adjusted adult means attaining a stable sexual identity, biologically, socially, psychologically. If science says that human adults grow normally into sexual identities, then we had better start talking as if we have sexual identities or want them, because otherwise we risk being diagnosed as immature or abnormal. But we need something more specific than Colley's broad claim. We need to observe what promises the new category makes to people as it functions in particular exchanges. In its actual uses, I count at least 4 promises. Sexual identities comfort, instruct, organize, and market. Each of these functions relies on distinct meanings that have fused in the word identity. I don't doubt that sexual identities do comfort us. They simplify what's confusing, they domesticate what's wild, they make a kind of stable sense out of desires, feelings, sensations, acts, partners. Sexual identities also supply us with a language for what can leave us tongue-tied. What do you want? I'm straight. Putting on a sexual identity gives you a label that you can apply to yourself. What is more, the identity links this label to the consoling notion of a natural kind, born that way, born one way, just this way, according to a natural pattern. Sexual identity promises to comfort us by reinforcing self-identity. I am sexually coherent with myself. I am identical to myself. Next, sexual identities instruct us. They lay down a set of shared expectations about how to behave, what to like, what to wear when, and which songs to put in high rotations on iTunes this week. you've surely noticed that identity instructions can be quite specific. Because this is a confession, don't tell anyone. But because I'm not much interested in Broadway musicals or Princess Di, some of my friends worry that I'm not really gay. It doesn't matter that I'm married to the same man for 20 years. It's that I don't tear up at the mention of Princess Di. And I think this example also shows how quickly the prescriptions change from decade to decade. But what persists is the way that sexual identities extrapolate from sexual desire or behavior to supposedly shared tastes and attitudes. Because you desire this sex, therefore you must also like these things. Having a sexual identity means that you must always strive to become more yourself by adhering more closely to what the identity instructs you to be. In this case, identity means ideal or aspiration. Sexual identities also organize us. They count us as unit-like members of a political group. They reduce individual difference in service of solidarity. This is the crucial pivot by which some sexual identities take a legal and social stigma and turn it into a positive essence. You're a faggot becomes gay pride. That reversal can be an important step, both politically and psychologically. I'm not at all denying that. The problem is that it posits a sameness in all members of the stigmatized class. The false unity of the insult becomes the false unity of an identity. This is the mathematical sense of identity as equality. Last but hardly least, sexual identities allow us to participate with remarkable efficiency in sexual marketplaces. In the old days, dear friends, when gay men used to rely on the classified advertising section of the Advocate to find partners, there was a very detailed set of symbols that were used in ads to specify what you were looking for. But we needn't dig back into the archive because the obvious example here is the online hookup app. Not that you have one on your phone, right? But if you look at online, for example, if you look at the sexual options offered by Tinder or Grindr or OkCupid, you will see this last function of sexual identities. Want to hook up fast? Choose one of the identities and squeeze your desires inside it. That's what the app requires you to do. There's much more to be said about the promises made by a system of sexual identities, but I want now to turn to the system's unadvertised consequences. What does sexual identity do, in fact, when people start to use it? The most obvious unadvertised consequence of talking in terms of sexual identities is their endless multiplication. Sexual identities multiply because there are no clear criteria for how much of what kind of difference constitutes a new identity, right? We don't know what counts to make something a sexual identity. And I think there can't be clear criteria because sexual identities move back and forth through contradictory notions of biology, medicine, and social expression. Let me give you an example. Do you know any Therians? Are you yourself, perhaps, a Therian? A Therian is someone who identifies as a particular animal. According to one questionnaire that circulates on the internet, which is always the ultimate authority in sexual matters, you are a Therian or therianthrope if you feel that you are that animal in some way, You feel a connection, perhaps a spiritual connection to that animal. You feel at home when you think of that animal. Your experience shifts into that animal. Therians are not to be confused with furries or puppy players or horse players or other groups who adopt animal costumes or behaviors during sex. But some Therians do consider their identity to be a sexual identity, while other Therians hotly deny this. What is clear is that Therians are now forming social groups. They have websites, actual and virtual meetings, a YouTube channel, and fan fiction. All the marks of a complete culture. Yeah. There is even a growing market in Therian young adult fiction. So why not count Therian as a new sexual identity? Without meaning in the slightest to offend anyone here, I suggest that we take it instead as an illustration of the tendency to multiply sexual identities in the absence of criteria for what constitutes an identity. There are dozens of other examples, some of which you doubtless know better than I do. But here again, I want to move beyond general description of multiplication to observe its differentiated effects, and specifically how it undoes the advertised functions of sexual identity. So these, I think, are the actual effects of a system of sexual identity. Let me describe the effects as splitting, splintering, standardizing, and freezing in place. They correspond to the 4 advertised functions, but I'm putting them in a different order to make a point. Let's start with the advertised comfort of identity. The multiplication of identities means that each of us is regularly acquiring new identities, whether we want to or not. Often when a new aspect of human experience is added to the identity system, it also projects a new identity for the people not included in that new category. So homosexual projects heterosexual. As you may remember, the word heterosexual in English comes after the word homosexual. Kink projects vanilla. Trans generates cis. And Therian generates non-Therian. The number of sex or gender-related identities each of us carries increases. I see this as a splitting up of more and more aspects of an individual's erotic experience. Something similar happens with regard to the usefulness of sexual identities for organizing. You can see this in campus organizations, at least you can at Harvard. You can also see it in national political groups. Having a sexual identity is supposed to make organizing easier. Indeed, that's one of the main claims made for sexual identities, that we can't organize without them. But the tendency of identities to multiply means that identity-based movements splinter. I'm not denying that there are good reasons for breaking up. From the 1950s on, it's been the case that many organizations for homosexuals were dominated by white gay men of a certain class and position, or that many women's organizations were dominated by heterosexual white women. Other kinds of people were right to complain that their views and interests were ignored. What is more important to me, they were right to resist the unitary claim of the main identities. I love that picture of her, by the way. Perhaps you know this passage from Audre Lorde, which is tied to her claim that each individual is a particular combination of particular differences. I actually find Lorde more helpful in thinking about what we call intersectionality than Kimberly Crenshaw, but that's another conversation. So here's the passage. Bringing women together was not enough. We were different. Being gay girls together was not enough. We were different. Being black together was not enough. We were different. Being black women together was not enough. We were different. Being black dykes together was not enough. We were different. You can watch Lord in this passage both protesting the false unities and resisting individual splintering for the sake of individual distinctness. That leads to the two other advertised benefits of sexual identities and their undoing. I've already hinted at some of the negative effects of instructing and marketing. Receiving the instruction manual for a sexual identity, you did get it, didn't you? No. It can be a great help, but it can also standardize your individual desires. So too with the function of identities in sexual markets. Hookup apps require an agreed vocabulary of identities to enable transactions to take place efficiently. But inscribing yourself into one of those categories can also freeze your sexual explorations. I joined standardizing and freezing because together they produce what is for me the most troubling effect of the system of sexual identities. Let me describe it in two ways, first with a short story and then using more general terms. For a while, I've been studying a writer by the name of Jeff Maynes. I originally got interested in him because he wrote one of the first books about the spirituality of gay male leather communities. The book is called Urban Aboriginals, and it's filled with references to spiritual experiences or contacts, spiritual forces and yearnings, spiritual arts or rituals. Searching out other writings by Maynes, I found his journals. They narrate his coming out as gay and then finding his way into leather sex, which he always wrote as one word. While an undergraduate at the University of Toronto, Maynes rejects his childhood Christianity in favor of a spiritualism in life and beauty. He also rejects for a while, on grounds of psychological health, the homosex he had been having with a high school friend. A few years later, he undergoes a mystical experience at an English cathedral. 2 years after that, Maynes finally decides to come out as gay. 5 years further on, in 1977, he is exploring leather sex and pursuing his interest in altered states of consciousness, and he cannot see any difference between those two. What stands out in Maynes's journals, as in some other accounts of coming out, is the sense of unending exploration. Even when Maynes becomes active in the San Francisco leather scene, he is looking to learn about his own sex and about sex as such. Putting on an identity does not answer his deepest questions. He continues with the deliberate long-term shaping of life for flourishing. You can call this shaping sexuality, you can call it spirituality. For now, let me call it by an old word that includes both, the word ethics. The standardizing and freezing that are consequences of a system of sexual identities can stop ethical inquiry short. Oh, there are ethical rules built into identities, but that's my point. They are ready-made rules. They cut off inquiry, discernment, experimentation, creation. Most of all, by stressing nature, they make it seem as if the pattern for yourself is finished, complete. You're supposed to figure out which identity you really are and then live within its prescriptions, as if finding your sexual identity finished your growth in sexual ethics. Stopping inquiry, I think, is designed into the category of sexual identity. Remember Colley. His category combines nature with medical management with social adjustment. The nature part of the category naturalizes certain desires, choices, expressions. The medical management part of the category, sexual identity, supports verdicts on which desires and behaviors are to be counted as healthy, stable, final. Finally, the social adjustment part of the category encourages the policing of identity performance. Larger issues rise up here. The most obvious consequence of the category sexual identity is that it fits sex into a grand scheme of other identities. Identities have become the basic categories for contemporary management of human life. And yet, sexual variety is not the same as racial variety, which is not the same as income stratification, and so on. Much less can the elaborated expression of human variety be plotted onto a single graph of all identities. This chart is impossible. But that's another lecture and an even longer conversation. So let me instead reach towards some conclusions about the questions around sexual identity. I've been arguing that having certain sexual desires or certain kinds of sex need not imply an identity. In fact, I keep insisting you would be better off not thinking of your sexual life in terms of an identity. For long-term ethics, which is the only kind of ethics that finally matters, it's better to be unidentified. Which brings us to the last question. If we suddenly stop talking about sexual identities this afternoon, what other ways could we talk? To me, this is the most interesting and most important question, because I think there's a strong connection between language and the imagination of our lives. This is an ethical question. That is a challenge to find or make shapes of language that will help you flourish. The first step in addressing this ethical question is to try to speak what sex is for you without reference to the available categories so far as that's possible. Human sexual diversity is much wider than the identity categories allow. Our sexual education or miseducation is a long effort to get us to place ourselves within a scheme of classification, whether religious, medical, social, stylistic. Very rarely are we encouraged to ask basic questions about our sexual selves and then to answer them candidly with all our felt ignorance and uncertainty. One of my favorite tools for self-questioning and self-speaking comes from a book by Eve Sedgwick called Epistemology of the Closet. In it, she tries to write out some basic truths about sexual diversity that adults somehow know but never acknowledge. Her first axiom is this: Sedgwick apologizes for beginning with something so simple and obvious. She does it because people often fail to say the simplest things about sex. It's astonishing how much of sexual ethics, and not just religious sexual ethics, but it's astonishing how much of sexual ethics is simply the expression of personal taste, right? We are too busy talking confidently about identities in order to be able to remember basic things like this. So Sedgwick continues. Even identical genital acts mean very different things to different people. To some people, the nimbus, the halo, the aura of the sexual seems scarcely to extend beyond the boundaries of discrete genital acts. To others, it unfolds them loosely or floats virtually free of them. Some people spend a lot of time thinking about sex, others little. Some people like to have a lot of sex, others little or none. Many people have their richest mental emotional involvement with sexual acts that they don't do or even don't want to do. For some people, it is important that sex be embedded in contexts resonant with meaning, narrative, and connectedness with other aspects of life. For other people, it's important that they not be. To others, it doesn't occur that they might be. I won't take you through the rest of Sedgwick's list, but I urge you to find it and then use it for an exercise in speaking your own sexual character. One of the most interesting things is you may discover that you don't yet know how you stand with respect to some of the things Sedgwick is talking about, in which case you can use her list to conduct your own ethical and poetic experiments in the privacy of your dorm room or of your imagination. The one thing I would ask you to notice right now is how little of Sedgwick's list is captured by our ordinary table of sexual identities. The things she's talking about, which are important differences in sex, are not captured by sexual identity. Sexual identity may have been a category useful for advocating sexual diversity at one time, but once it was deployed systematically, it became a way of confining sexual diversity to certain approved axes. In fact, let me suggest that the category sexual identity represents a stage of acquaintance with human sexual difference that we have already surpassed. As a historian of sex, I would urge you to remember that we have had only a few decades in which to consider publicly a full range of sexual desires and dispositions. Is it likely that we've got it all figured out after 40 years? Is it likely that the first terms we invented in the 1950s were the best? Our lives have already moved beyond the understanding petrified in the category sexual identity. By this point at the very end of my lecture, you may be saying, okay, maybe you're right historically, but I don't have the time or energy for sexual discernment and creation and language making. I just want to have a lot of sex. Or you may be saying, I like my identity, at least this week. Or you may be saying, sex, I'm more worried about my GPA. And let me make I'm sorry, that was a Harvard response. Yeah, see, we have information. The student newspaper at Harvard conducts a survey of incoming students. So we have fairly accurate, we hope fairly accurate, self-descriptions of our first-year class. So when I look up at this sea of faces in my class on sexual ethics, many of whom are first-year or second-year students, and no matter what bizarre sexual activity I mention, they all nod knowingly. Oh, yes, right. Yes, Jell-O, yes, Jell-O, yeah. 3 leather whips and a shower curtain. Oh, of course, that's so passé, right? And I'm thinking to myself, I know that 30% of you are virgins, right? So, let me suggest at least this. This may not, in fact, be the right time for you to undertake an ethical inquiry into your unidentified sex. Okay, that's fine. Put it off. I'll continue to hope that the right time arrives, because I'm willing to make 3 predictions about the sexuality of the people in this room 20 years from now, for those of you who will be around in 20 years. Your sexual self-understanding will most probably change. Your desires may also change, even a lot. The available categories will certainly change. So if you put all of your sexual truth into one of the identities on the market now, you may well find yourself painfully dumped once the identity begins to dissolve around you. Be kind to your future self. Keep a little distance between your sex and the identities that now claim to capture it. Thank you.
So I've been in your place many times, and I'm going to try to somehow respond to Mark's lecture without telling you what I think it means and without getting in the way of us talking together. And so really I just want to sort of further some of Mark's questions and intensify them. So some years ago, I was asked by Professor Del McWhorter to participate in a conversation here at the University of Richmond about, of all things, the importance of medieval philosophy. And I was asked to do so with a senior colleague. I was fresh out of grad school in my first job at Penn State University. So the task we were given at that event was that we were supposed to speak about why one should care at all about the thought of dead people from the Middle Ages, why it's relevant today, is it relevant today, and why do seemingly intelligent people like us spend a lot of time thinking about the Middle Ages. Now, as it turns out, my senior colleague with whom I was invited was already quite famous, and therefore he was invited to also give a paper at William and Mary. Now, since I drove down from Penn State, from State College, Pennsylvania, I volunteered to drive him to Williamsburg, my first ever visit. Now, I will never forget our lovely morning walk through colonial Williamsburg, talking about bonnets and Walter Benjamin. And his paper at that event was, on all things, Michel Foucault. And as I remember, the topic of that lecture was, for those of you familiar with the history of sexuality, the seemingly outrageous specificity of Michel Foucault's dating the appearance of the homosexual. Now, after the paper, we were invited to a reception at which were present what I seem to be the entire community of out gay men in Williamsburg, as well as a number of lesbians, and, well, now notice we're already at the heart of Mark's problem. I'll return to this in a moment. Now, on the drive back to Richmond, my senior colleague, who was a medievalist and turned historian of sex, said to me, "Do you ever get tired of that?" "What?" I asked. "Do you ever get tired of gay men assuming that you're gay?" Now, the flip side of that question is a different one. Do I ever grow tired of men identifying me as heterosexual and as a result putting me out of play, putting me out of the market? If it's not clear to you, that then recently reformed Thomist turned historian of sex was Professor Mark Jordan. Now, that situation and the flip side, I think, goes to the very heart of the questions that Mark wants us to consider. Now, just to butter my bread also on the other side for a moment, another way of asking some of Mark's questions is to ask a question I learned from Professor McWhorter's Bodies and Pleasures. When it comes to the diversity of practices, acts, and activities that we might group under the general label sex, would it not make more sense to organize those practices and activities around pleasures rather than around identities? If you think about a number of sex practices, the genitalia, let alone the identity of the people having those genitalia, need not, and here I emphasize need not, to show that they can, but they need not relate to the pleasure involved. There are several interesting footnotes in Dell's book that I will refer you to in order not to speak those acts out loud. Notice that Professor Jordan spoke for roughly 40 minutes on the topic of sex without ever talking about any acts that we might say were sex acts. One of my friends at Penn State, Professor Jeffrey Nealon, used to say, what I learned from Foucault is religion, very interesting to talk about, not so interesting to do. Sex, not so interesting to talk about, really interesting to do. Now, so as I mentioned, I have no desire to either delay or channel our discussion of the questions Mark raises today. Nor do I want to put my own answers to his questions in front of yours. Rather, I would like to add just two more questions that I think follow from the ones Mark raises, and I want to do so very briefly, even if I risk a little bit of theoretical thinness. My first question branches off from Mark's first question. On his way toward asking whether we, human adults, have to have sexual identity, Mark raises the interesting history of the very speaking about sexual identity. He is astute in pointing out that ways of talking are not just decoration, or, to use an older term, ways of talking are not just superstructure that dresses up what is really going on. Rather, these ways of talking provide us with ways of understanding and ways of ordering. When we talk about identity, gay, straight, queer, cis, trans, asexual, we are ordering. But what? Are we ordering agents? Are we ordering acts? Are we ordering identities, inclinations, desires? Or are we ordering our society as a whole? While Mark rightly encourages us to act and think ahead, especially toward the end of his remarks tonight, I can't help but think back. I am, in fact, an unrepentant metaphysician, and I always want to know, what is it you're talking about? Theoretically, and maybe even practically, Mark points to the instability of the very notion of sexual identity. And this is right. But on the other hand, we need to do things. From having sex to overthrowing governments to eating and to just going on. It often seems then, in our everyday world, sexual identity remains remarkably stable. And then the question comes, how do these unstable categories that organize our doing when it comes to sex remain so seemingly stable? This might be another way of showing that, as Mark says, sexual identity is a zombie category. But as my opening story shows, not even Professor Jordan can kill a zombie. Now, I myself am very interested in these kinds of entities, these kinds of things that, while not existing, think of gender, race, class, or sexual identity, they don't exist like tables and chairs. And yet, can we say that they aren't real? They seem to exist, I would say, less like zombies and more like ghosts. They seem to haunt our world, and I want to continue thinking about how these ghosts continue to operate, all the while we keep pointing out they don't exist. My second, and so now just to keep score for a moment, Mark has 3 questions, I just raised 1, and now I'm adding a 5th. This is a fork of Mark's second question. What is sexual identity supposed to do for us? Now, Mark shows the ways in which an identity should, and sometimes in fact does, become an ideal for us, an aspiration, and that as an ideal and an aspiration, it moves toward group solidarity. Now, at this point, I think my initial story needs to be expanded. I love Broadway musicals. And, not to put too fine a point on it, I pay way more attention to style and fashion than Professor Jordan does. I do not like Princess Di, but I love Judy Garland. And I love sparkles. Yet, I am also married to a woman with whom I've shared my life for over 20 years. Now, Mark's question all those years ago about whether I tire was not directed at identity as such. He didn't ask me, aren't sexual identities tiring? But about an identity being assumed that did not match mine. So what is this identity supposed to do for us? What is this group solidarity that the ideal moves toward? Now, I'm sure that Mark is right, that this group toward which we move in solidarity is one in which differences necessarily must be minimized. But they are often also suppressed, and frequently they are even annihilated. Still, I wonder if there isn't some practical usefulness to what Gayatri Spivak and others call, and Mark hinted at this in his remark, strategic essentialism. That is, for reasons of political action, can this identity not be beneficial? But there's a flip side to this question as well. Is identity only something I have, or is it something I do? And I note that Mark never uses the phrase in his entire paper, identify with. And I wonder if there isn't a way of thinking an identity as identifying with one another. Because I'm afraid that if we don't identify with one another, we open ourselves to all sorts of oppression, probably at the hands of the very categories of sexual identity whose dangers Mark so cogently warns us about. I think this is a question worth thinking about. I want to end by echoing what I take to be Mark's closing exhortation. I would put it this way. There is more in heaven and on earth than is dreamt of in your sexual identity. There are ways of flourishing, ways of experiencing and giving pleasure. In short, what used to be summed up under the old-fashioned ethical term happiness, than we have imagined under any concept of sexual identity. There might be different forms of organizing, assembling, of drawing together for sex and sexual pleasure. And these ways of organizing and assembling and drawing together might in fact open new kinds of pleasures, which in turn may open even more forms of assembling and drawing together and organizing, which in turn will lead to new forms of pleasure. We have yet to come to terms with the effect that sexual identity has on our well-being, and the thinking of what it means to be well, I take it, is the very definition of ethics. Thanks, Mark. Let me do this for you, sir.
Hi. So, thank you for speaking. Like, that was awesome. But I wanted to ask, so you're saying that stepping away from sexual identities or sexual orientation identities can be helpful in the sense that it relieves you of the pressure to conform to that group. And just for all of the reasons that you mentioned, all the problems associated with that. And I'm wondering where your stance is when it comes to gender identities. So, yeah. If you've thought about that at all.
Thank you a lot for that question, because one of the things I had to simplify in getting the lecture down to 40 minutes was that question. Let me say two different things. So most of my work for several decades has been more on the sex side than the gender side, in the sense that my stuff is called History of Sex. I work on category of sexuality. But the longer I work at it, the more it seems to me that the root is gender, and specifically the power relations encoded into the male-female binary. One of the things that's lurking in all of that set of questions is the really, to me, unsettling relations between sex and violence, which we can see in so many ways, not just in what people do, but in our speech and so on and so on. So yeah, I also believe, in fact, believe even more strongly, and I wonder if you'd agree with this. I think at least in the academic bubbles we inhabit, people are getting better with gender fluidity, at least theoretically better, than they sometimes are with sexual fluidity. But I would think that those two are inseparable. Yeah. Let me pick up one other thing too, which is part of what Rick said. The other simplification I made was also the question of identification as a verb. One of the things that I like in my gender fluid students, or the students I've accompanied through transition, is that they're often not seeking a model out there, right? It's not like I'm going to become a woman just like Mildred Pierce, I'm going to become a woman 1948 suburban model. But they're willing just to proceed with the transition, not knowing what comes, not knowing what they will become. And I think that teaches us something about how we should proceed with sex as well. It seems to me we tend to view sex still as, I need to discover which category I fit into, rather than this is an exploration and I really don't know where it's going to lead. And it may continue to lead. I may never settle. I may keep moving. Does that make sense? Yeah. Can I tell someone else?
So on one of your questions, you defined like the discussion of sexual identity as adult persons, and I was wondering how like the idea of like policing pleasures as like children, when children are figuring out their world and like the otherness and themselves, how that plays into like why you chose to define as the sexual identity doesn't occur until adulthood, or at least the question defined it only in regards to adults.
Yeah, I thank you for that too. I really agree. I left it out partly because Freud was sitting in a chair on the other side of the desk glaring at me. That is, I didn't want to get into the question of the 3 essays on sexuality. I didn't want to get into the question of the stabilization of sexual identity. But I think your question points to something else, which we've been avoiding culturally for a while. And Gail Rubin says this very plainly. She says that at the time that she wrote Thinking Sex, when she was looking forward to what she hoped for the future of sex in the United States, that one of the things she expected to happen was much greater frankness about childhood sexuality and the sexual rights of adolescents. And it seems to me, as Gail will be the first to say, we've moved in the opposite direction. We simply cannot talk about sexual rights for adolescents, and especially after the abuse scandals, we cannot talk about the sexual desires of children. So that was another reason why I just sort of kept it away, because those are culturally taboo topics that are really, really hard to talk about. Thank you.
So I also have a taboo topic. I really love the idea of categories and characters. And I think a key category we use is a procedural category called consent. And so consent becomes, particularly in an administrative setting, becomes almost the fulcrum for determining whether sex is acceptable and ethical or unacceptable and not ethical, with various sort of pseudo-legal procedures surrounding that. And so I really noticed that one of the procedures that emerges in the 20th century, it's not there before that, is the way sexual relationships get inserted into a bureaucracy. And it is a pseudo-legal bureaucracy. It has nothing to do with pleasure or vulnerability. We don't talk about that period, but we really need that word consent and its procedural elaboration to make sense of what appears to me the only public ethical conversations we have. And so I guess I want to, you also live in a university setting. I guess I wonder, is that too taboo to talk about, or can we talk about that? Are there different words to use?
I'm thinking three things at once, which is always very dangerous. The question of consent in sex is actually a really interesting. It's a really this problem of real, what I would think of as real consent versus legal consent, goes back at least to medieval definitions of the consent required for marriage. So the Peter Lombard, 12th century theologian, in talking about the nature of marriage, is one of the people who begins to set down the criteria for the appropriate expression of consent that can be considered binding in marriage. So I think you're right to point to this, and this moving into procedure of something much more complicated goes way back. One of the things, so I have been on Harvard's Title IX policy committee for the last 3 years. So we're not the body. Harvard has its own separate bureaucracy for processing cases, but there's also a university committee of faculty, staff, students that talks about the policy issues of it, or was talking about it until a certain recent political change in Washington. We won't go there. But the simple way to say it is that Harvard does not have what's called an affirmative consent policy, in the sense that we allow consent to be expressed non-verbally, and so we don't follow the sort of old Antioch model that you need an explicit statement of consent for each sexual act and at each stepping up of the level of intimacy in the sexual act. And to be honest, you're safer if it's written down and notarized. But we don't have that. What we have is an attempt to get around that. It's supposed to be more intuitive. It's actually just more confusing for most people. And so many of the students simply don't understand what it means. But the astonishing thing for me about this, as an old second wave feminist, right, is we took down consent as a category. I mean, McKinnon's critique of consent is devastating. Her point is, what does it mean for a woman to consent under a system of patriarchy, right? The consent is extorted. So whenever I say that in class, the student advocates for affirmative consent policies get rightly angry with me because they say that's the best tool we've got. And in some ways, I think, I'm just restating your question, but see, that's part of the problem. I don't know anything about what the procedures here, so I'm only talking about Harvard, and I'm talking as an individual faculty member, not a member of the Title IX committee, okay? But the letter that started the most recent round of discussions about this in universities should have been the beginning of a conversation rather than the end of a conversation. So figuring out what a university has to do in order to comply with federal policy, that's not the end of the conversation about sex and violence in a university. That's the bare beginning. And so what I keep saying is, okay, if we've got to do this, we've got to have these policies because the feds say so, great, let's do it. But let's then try to go on into further conversations around issues like consent. Can we find a fuller way of describing the realities of sexual relation? Yeah. We're still trying really hard to start those conversations. I hope you all are further and better along than we are. But, yeah.
Thank you. Hi. So you talk about the importance of removing sexual identity from our main cultural vocabulary, and that's fine. Do you think, though, that there is a place for a sort of identity label when it comes to everyday conversations between two people or sexually consenting partners in what they want or what you're looking for as like sort of a market situation, just to simplify, you know, what you're looking for and what you want versus having to go through this giant list of non-identifying language every single time? Do you believe there's a usefulness in that? Or do you believe that it's important just to get rid of it entirely? If that makes sense as a question.
No, it does. Yeah, but the trick is in that, so sometimes if I'm in a situation where someone doesn't know me and you know, and I'm passing, right? So like I'm keeping my wrists still and not rolling my eyes. Someone will sometimes make a homophobic remark in my presence, and then I feel compelled to say, I am what people would call a gay man. And it seems to me in that kind of situation, like on a first date or on texting back and forth and arranging a hookup or whatever, we of course use abbreviations. The problem or the challenge is to use them and not believe them, or that is to use them at a certain moment of initial contact. Because in fact, whatever the identity is that you apply to yourself, your sexual pleasures are much more specific than that label can prescribe. And so at best, that's a kind of beginning point, right? And I think one of the hardest things for human beings to do is to talk honestly with their sexual partners about what it is that gives them pleasure in all of its detail. And so I would say, yeah, if you've got to start that by using a label, use the label, and then as soon as possible, get rid of it and try to talk about what you want, not as a straight person or a lesbian or, you know, a Therian, or, but as you. Yeah. You all have been very patient. Does everyone recognize this image, by the way? This is from the new Blade Runner film. This is Blade Runner 2049. And I take it that one of the questions that this film asks is, what's it like to have an erotic relation, or to have your principal erotic relation with a holographic projection? And what kind of identity is that? Thanks.